record. Um, so hey, Tobie, thanks for talking. You are um, the principal at Unlock Open, and you argue that teams that contribute to open source gain a net competitive advantage over teams that don't. Um,
Yeah, that's part of the work I do indeed.
yeah, so I'm a fan of open source as well. I've worked on big open source projects for a bunch of my career. And now, you and I are both small business owners. That's how I met you.
Absolutely.
And I recently bought, in the business world, a very small business. But for me, as a as an as a small business owner with no outside funding, it feels very big and very
Yeah,
intimidating.
I bet.
So I bought a small SaaS business, and I'm thinking about open sourcing it, about putting my money where my mouth is. And it's scary for a bunch of reasons, and I thought I should ask your advice.
That sounds great. So yeah, to give a bit of context to the people listening at home, I I did have a look at the website, but I have very little context beyond that. So you're really gonna see the process that we get through, right? Uh,
Yeah.
so sort of how I work and yeah, try to figure out. I'm seeing you getting blurry again, but well, hopefully that's not going to be on the video. We'll see. Anyway, maybe you should start by telling me a bit about what this business is doing, and then we can get into the reason why you would want to open source it, and also what parts, or if you're considering to open source the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
So for a start, maybe a bit about what the business does, and we should start with the name of the business. And I don't know. Do you want to share that?
Yeah. I think
Okay.
that would be totally fine. So my existing business is doing consulting
Sure.
around DevOps, and that's kindlyops.com. But I've always wanted to own my own SaaS company, run my own SaaS business. So we're looking to
I can
diversify
relate
our
to that.
revenue.
Hmm.
And this is lots of people will tell me this is a bad idea. We bought a totally unrelated business. And so the new thing that we just bought is called chirpyhire.com. And that is a text message based screening system for recruiting and hiring. So when you
Okay.
post a job advertisement, somebody wants to come in and interview, they're interested in the job. Um, Chirpy Hire will give you your own local phone number, and you put that in the job ad. People can text that phone number and get a few screening questions over text message. They can answer the screening questions. If they qualify,
Hmm.
then they can get an interview scheduled. And so it streamlines the amount of work for the recruiter and gets much faster feedback to the people applying to the job.
Okay. Yeah, I can see how that would be a useful piece of software. So, so what is driving you? Well, I mean, I guess the first question is: are you planning to? I mean, is this a business where you're planning to make money, or is this something that you're doing because you find it fun?
This is definitely about trying to make money and grow our company, diversify
Okay.
our revenue streams. So we've written some open source software before. We were working on a different product, but that's not launched yet. The reason
Hmm.
that we bought this company in particular is because it has existing customers, existing paying customers. So they've already
Okay.
passed a bunch of hurdles there. So when
Sure.
we buy the assets of the business, we buy the source code, and that's the core IP, but then also all of the existing subscription customers and that revenue
Sure.
stream.
Okay. So no, because that sort of like clarifies the context of making a decision around whether you want to open source the project or not, right? Open
Yeah,
source bits of the projects or not.
and
So
a little more context. There was
sure.
150 other people interested in buying the company. So this was through a broker, and
Wow.
several of
Okay.
them, were there were other competitive final offers, right? That got all the way through to the end, and so I ended up
Wow. Okay.
winning and being able to purchase it. But there are definitely other parties who wanted to buy the same company.
Okay, so there's a lot of interest for the service, or at least what could be done
What?
with that service in terms of revenue generation or for other means, right? To
Yeah.
I guess, I mean, not all of your competitors, um, I mean, some of them were probably in a business closer to what the SaaS is about than you are.
Yeah, potentially.
So why would you want to open source it?
For everything else that we've built at my company, that's sort of been a default. It's been a default I've been pushing for a long time. That the question, or I think a healthy perspective is why not open source something that you're building. But I feel like that's a lot easier to do when you're building something that doesn't exist yet. But when you're taking something that already exists and it's closed, all of a sudden the question gets a lot more intimidating, right? So I'm trying to change the current state of something.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I always, it's funny because I'm going to be in the opposite role that I'm used to, right? I mean, it is generally the case that people are scared and not too keen to open source. Well, that's not true because I also see sort of the opposite. The position you're in right now was one that I've seen before, right? It's not like completely new, but generally people want reasons to open source, not reasons not to, right? And I mean, for SaaS, the reason not to open source, if you're actually trying to make money out of it, right, which seems to be the case, is that, you know, the 150 other people that wanted to buy the software suddenly sort of have it for free, except for the customer base.
Yeah.
Right? So another way of looking at it, if you open source it, is you've bought a customer base, plus there's free open source code.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, that's worth thinking about. Would you have paid that much just for that customer base? Since I don't have details as to how much you spent, and I don't know how many customers you have, and we don't need to disclose this information, right? But like, you know, I think that's a first valid question to ask yourself: is would that purchase like that have made sense in and of itself?
Right. So I think there's kind of three assets involved, or three categories of assets involved. One, of course, is the source code and those things. One is the sort of trademarks and names and things like that. And then the third is those customer relationships. And without getting into too much specifics about price, like the way these things are typically valued, it gets a little weird at the low end and a little weird at the high end. But the way that a business is typically valued would be somewhere between 2 and 4 times the annual revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can look at the expenses and there's profit in there, but generally you're going to pay somewhere between 2 and 4 times the annual revenue stream.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if the code was, I'm thinking about the Apache license. If the code was open source and Apache licensed, I would have absolutely had to pay the same price, because the price is based on the amount of revenue that the business is generating. And it would have already been, like, regardless of the license of the source code, it would have been generating a certain amount of revenue that would have determined the price.
Okay, so that's interesting. So basically the source code itself has practically no value. Well, yeah, it's interesting.
It's interesting, right? Because without that
Yes,
source
it's a
code,
good question.
I can't keep the business running. But if other people have access to the source code, it doesn't stop me from keeping the business running.
Well, I mean, they could undercut you, right?
Sure. So then I think that's an interesting question. Is like, you know, you asked why open source, and I just like to make everything open source. But why do I like to make everything open source? I feel like it gives you more opportunity to have conversations around the thing that you're building. And it allows other people to learn from and apply the technology in areas that you're not able to, whether it's because they don't have time or expertise. And so then if someone wants to do that competitively and start another business, are they going to get any customers? Are they going to steal any customers, right? Are they going to prevent me from getting any customers, or are they going to get a set of customers that I would not have been able to reach? And
That's a tough question to answer.
Yeah.
I mean, so I frankly, like I have a number of concerns around monetizing open source software is difficult, right? And you don't have a lot of cases of sort of a SaaS that is also completely open source. I mean, I'm thinking sort of like WordPress as an example of that.
Sure.
GitLab to some degree, though I'm not sure that their whole code base is exactly open source. I'm not sure that you can actually. So one of the things that happens, and WordPress was sort of that space at some point, is that you sometimes have a difference between being able to use the application itself, right? Or actually, so basically the code that makes it possible to spin multiple instances of the application and handle multiple customers isn't open source, right? So you can't just basically put the project on like a container somewhere and be in business, right? You can have a solution that works for you, but not necessarily a solution that works for you to create a business for. Sorry. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think an important part of the consideration is whether this would. So I think there's two potential groups of people. One is like, would my clients just use the software, our customers just use the software for free instead of paying us for the service? And then would other people start businesses who are not my customers but competitors?
Yes.
And offer
These are two
competing
different
businesses.
things.
So I think those are two interesting cases. Someone who was going to pick up the code and start a business with it would need to set up business relationships with all the necessary service providers, right? So the telephony provider for provisioning phone numbers,
Sure.
hosting, credit card processing, support, all of those things. So I think there's enough of those things that it certainly wouldn't stop somebody else from starting a business, but I think it certainly would stop a customer from thinking it was more cost effective to run the software themselves, because it's not. Like there's some overhead.
So I mean, I think in general, when you're looking at software that is available open source, take WordPress for example. WordPress is really easy one to work with. WordPress.com, like the paying service, is not competing against someone actually setting up a WordPress.org, like setting up the open source code, right? Because they wouldn't be buying from them in the first place, right? I mean, this is you probably remember when there was all of the pirating issues with the music industry, right?
Yeah.
And they were sort of having this thing like, oh, there's like 1 billion or whatever the number was, right? Like 1 billion people like streaming, stealing, like 1 billion songs stolen, or whatever the numbers were. This equals to 1 billion times 199 or whatever, how much they were saying each song was actually worth, right? And that's a completely wrong way of looking at the picture, because out of those 1 billion stolen songs, none of them, or like only a small portion of them, would actually have been bought. Right? It's like people were downloading way more stuff than they would listen to, and they wouldn't have spent that money on these things. So you can't really compare these things, right? You're not, basically what I'm trying to say is, you're not losing customers from customers who would use the open source version, because they would not be clients of yours.
Right. So I don't think.
Well, most of them wouldn't. Right? They just wouldn't be using this.
And I've been thinking about the other case, the competitive business, right? Someone who starts another business. And what
That's
if,
the case I'm much more worried about.
yeah, and so I've been wondering what would happen if instead of worrying about that, if I explicitly encouraged it. What would happen if I not only open source this, but approached a handful of incubators and code boot camps and said, hey, here's a code base. We'll take patches to make it more modular and reusable. It's a text messaging engine. I can think of a dozen applications in addition to hiring that this could be used for, and encourage people to start other businesses.
So that's a different story, right? And I think maybe we should have started there. Like there is a really big difference between open sourcing the whole application and open sourcing, say, something that is core to it, but not the whole application. An example of that is, well, GitHub is a good example of that. So GitHub itself is not open source, right?
Right.
Git, of course, is, right? And for example, the Git bindings for Ruby or whatever it is that GitHub is using to do one of the things it does with Git is open source, right? And a whole bunch of what is in GitHub is open source, but not the app itself.
Right.
So then that's very different. If you feel like your core business was your app is the one that you described, and you feel like you could actually get more value if, well, the core engine in there, handling all of the messaging, basically, was improved, right? Maybe you could, I don't know, I didn't think through your particular business case, right? But let's say you could do group messaging, was it? Or, something like that. That isn't possible right now, right? But that your business would benefit from, right? Then suddenly it makes sense to create sort of a community of companies building on top of that core solution different business solutions, right? And it is really interesting and worthwhile for all of them because, when you're in that case, right, it would be silly for someone to compete against you in particular, right? Because it's not an easy thing to do. And it's probably a lot easier for them to target, I'm sure you can repurpose that sort of like messaging engine to make sure that people don't miss their dentist appointments, for example, right? Something like that, right? So that makes a lot of sense. And to me, this is exactly the kind of like thinking around open source that I really like. Because when you start open sourcing the whole thing, what you end up in is a situation where your competitive advantage can be two things: the brand, right? Or basically your ability to build services around it, right? Like just make it cheaper, make it more reliable, and you're suddenly turning into no longer sort of like a SaaS building company, but like DevOps.
Yeah.
Well, that's a different story because it turns out that this is more your thing than mine, for example, right?
Sure.
So this could be a good strategy. I mean, one of the way that WordPress is competitive is they're really, 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 really good at scaling WordPress.
Right.
Like they know how to do that better than anyone else, better even than the cloud providers. So, and they're super focused on that. So they can, they can make economies of scale that allow them to have a better service around WordPress hosting. I mean, basically, WordPress is in the business of hosting WordPress. That's what their business is.
Yeah.
So if that's what your plan is for your app, it makes sense to open source the whole thing. If your plan is not to compete on the efficiency of your DevOps basically around it, right? And of the underlying, in the underlying infrastructure costs. Then I like the strategy of saying, well, what are the pieces in there that are, modular, for lack of a better word, right? That are that stand on their own and that are sort of like agnostic to a particular business case, right? But that I, as a business owner, would benefit from seeing them improved and me not putting all the resources into that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective, and I certainly think that it I would be more likely to benefit from improvements to the code if it was sort of separated out like that. The thing I hesitate about is now I think from where I am today, that would sort of incur additional cost to me to refactor it
Upfront,
in
absolutely.
order to hold back some of the code. And I'm not. I think like architecturally, that's where the application should go anyway, right? Like it's more likely that I can reuse that in other places.
Yes, I mean that's a common benefit of open sourcing part of your software is you get better architecture out of it.
Yeah.
Ta-da.
Yeah. And better. You have to communicate about it and write some things down.
Yeah, better documentation, absolutely. Yes, better processes around how you do everything. Yeah, those are clear benefits. You just said something earlier, and it's gone. It was in my head for a second. I wanted to add something to that, and it just went poof. Well, I guess it's gone for good.
Yeah, the way I've been thinking about this investment, because it's an investment, right? I hope and believe that I can earn my money back and increase from there, right? Like that's my goal. I want to get a bunch of growth out of this and fund other work that we're doing. But I've been trying to think about worst case scenarios and best case scenarios. And so if I look 5 years down the road, a situation that I would be really, really happy with is that we've helped start some other small businesses. Like that would be just an incredible thing. So I don't want to, I wouldn't turn down $1 million, but that's not the reason I'm in business, right? The reason I'm in business is like to create jobs for myself and for other people. Like I think small business is really interesting and powerful and liberating. And so I'm very much in favor of trying to stimulate other people to start businesses and to give them a hand up. And then I also think about that's like the growth side, the positive potential. And then I think about like what's my risk tolerance for losing money? What's the worst possible case? So the worst possible case I think is that I lose all of the existing customers and the revenue stream goes to zero. And basically I never earn back the money that I put into the business.
So, working with the numbers you gave me earlier, I would be surprised if you open source this and you actually had an effective competitor in under 2 years, right? Because it is going to take time.
Right.
I mean, like there isn't that I know in this industry some people that are on the lookout for this, just like waiting for people to open source stuff and just like steal it, right? So I think this is a risk that can happen because some company can decide, oh, that's valuable, and have more resources than you do in terms of maybe just more capital for whatever reason, and be able to invest more, cut down prices, and sort of like steal your customer base. But I can't imagine this happening sort of like over a couple of weeks, right? Like this whole thing is going to take a bit of time. If it happens. So I would sort of like even mitigate your worst case scenario in the sense of saying, well, this is probably, you're probably going to get 2 years, even if like everything goes really badly, which means that you will recoup at least half of your investment, right? Yeah. If the numbers you gave me match, right? So, well, it's revenue, it's not profit. I imagine that the cost of running this is actually pretty low.
Um, yeah, and that's what's so attractive about a SaaS company, right? Is that there's decent
Sure.
margins.
Sure.
At the low end, where we are now, the margins are much worse, right? So you get a much better
Yes.
profit margin as
Yes.
you
Yes.
ramp up the number of
That
customers
makes
that
sense.
you have, and there's like a floor of costs.
What I was thinking about came back to me, and I think it's actually a useful data point to help you sort of make think this through. Um, I've helped a number of companies sort of open source their first product, or think about open source their first, sorry, not product, like project, right? And whereas it comes quite naturally for someone that's been in the open source space for a long time to know what works as an open source project and what doesn't, right? So we sort of have an intuitive sense of, oh yeah, we should open source this, or no, we shouldn't open source this. It's like not useful. It's going to take ages to get a community around it, right? And I actually dug into this question a bit, and it turns out that there are things that are more successful to open source than others. And when you think about it, it's obvious, right? It is a lot easier to build a community and have a successful open source project around software whose customers, whose users are also developers.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right? I mean, and so, for example, React.js is built in JavaScript, right? And used by JavaScript developers. It is very easy to get a ton of contributors because you just want to fix a bug of the thing you're using, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you look at, say, a browser engine, which is like in C++ or like in Rust or something like that, it is much harder for it to get contributors because, well, the people actually using the software, like people using browsers, right, or developers building HTML pages for browsers, don't know C++.
Right. It's a totally different.
Right, and if you push that, a bit more, like things like OpenOffice, where the user of the software, right, is someone that just doesn't want to use Microsoft Word or Google Docs, right? Like, how do you expect these users to actually be able to contribute to the source code? Like the intersection of, I'm a person that relies on Google, Microsoft Word for my day job, and I'm able to write C code to fix like a rendering bug in a text rendering engine, are like the intersection is very tiny, right?
For sure.
So if you actually release a SaaS, the whole thing was like the UI and stuff. Who would contribute to that is actually a lot less clear than if you release a core piece of software that developers can integrate in the stuff they're building.
Right.
Right?
It would be much more. So they would have to do all the extra work of like actually figuring out how to extract those pieces.
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you're releasing the whole thing, potential users of the whole thing are people who want to either use it for them, right, and not pay for the software. So people that are in the recruiting business, right, recruiters, not going to contribute back. Like, why would a recruiter be contributing back code? Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? Or there'll be potential competitors of your business, right? And they will not want to contribute back either, right? On the other hand, if what you release is the core engine of something that, say, I'm building an app, as we said, like a sort of like a thing for dentist appointments, right? Then I'm going to be a developer working in a small team, was like a UX person, and like maybe like some kind of like what are these developers called nowadays? Like the terms changes all the time. Like a full stack developer. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. And maybe like someone like handling sort of like QA or DevOps or something like that. And the chances of having them contribute to the code are much higher because they're now actually able to contribute back to this because it's in the same language that they're working for their whole app.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an
Plus,
interesting
they
point.
will
So
probably not be a competitor, right?
right. So it's like
I mean,
there's
the person
kind of two stages. One is like making the code available, but then there's like the milestone of actually developing some reasonably healthy community, some other person in the world looking at the code, talking to it, and potentially contributing to it. And I agree that is a higher bar, for sure.
Well, I mean, I think that is important in and of itself. So I agree with that. But what I'm trying to say is, for you, from a business perspective, it changes the risk, basically, for a number of reasons. Because not only is it offering people to use that software um, in a setting that has less chances of it being competing against yours, right? It's also targeting people that are probably less in the business of competing against other companies and more in the business of building software,
Yeah.
right? And finally, it's easier for you to build a community around it and benefit from the effects of open sourcing code beyond being able to say, I've open sourced it.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So, yeah, I think it's a much safer route, and a route that has a much higher potential of being actually beneficial beyond just being happy about open sourcing stuff.
Right. Yeah, that totally
So
makes
I
sense.
like that idea a lot more.
So that would be releasing the core messaging engine in some way that can be integrated into other products, whether
Yeah.
it's as a microservice or as a Rails library, whatever form that takes.
Yeah, so like, yeah, something like that. I mean, I don't have a good sense of what the architecture of your software is, right? Also, things. I'm not sure what would be strategically the best way of releasing something like this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it better as a library? Is it better sort of like as a microservice? That's an interesting question. I don't have a good sense of how the open source community feels about these things and sort of what the trends are right now around this. I generally see more sort of like Unixy thing than a library that handles one thing rather than sort of like a microservice architecture as an open source project. But given from what it is, though, it could be interesting to look at it that way too.
Yeah. The other, another, a completely additional set of constraints that I've got to worry about, and I've done some checking on this, is legal blockers for open sourcing. So I was very surprised when I first ran into this last year. But the licensing of any of those components, right? So I've got this stack of IP, and particularly around fonts, but also any frameworks or libraries or other things that were used by the original developers legally by purchasing a license, but that license allowed them to use it in one product, not to distribute those things as open source for other people to use.
Yes. So
I've been
that's
I've
the
been
problem
going,
you have.
Yeah, I've been going through it, and in one of our other projects, we had to go through and we had licenses to the fonts, but we had to change all of the fonts to be open fonts before we were able to open source it.
Yep.
And as far as we've been able to find, going through all of the history and talking with the original developer, we don't have any of those constraints. It is all original code. So I think our hands are free there. And then I think the last question for whichever piece of this whether it's the whole thing or just one component that we release, what license? Because I think the license also could encourage or inhibit other people from competing.
It's always a hard question.
It is, and so the way I've been thinking about it is, I want other people. If I release the code, I want other people to use the code. I want other people to get some benefit from the code. I don't want to push them away. So like I worked in the Ubuntu community for a long time, in the MySQL community for a long time. Heavy advocates of GPL, and I don't like GPL. I like level playing field licenses like Apache.
Frankly, I've seen. I mean, if you look at the large, for example, database companies going through IPOs right now. Well, yeah. Well, I mean, you have okay. I wasn't gonna go there, but like we can do that too. But you see both licenses, right? You see sort of like copyleft and like sort of Apache, MIT style licenses. I like Apache over MIT because it doesn't have sort of like this weird thing around whether patents are included or not. Right. I just find it a saner thing. It's a bit more wordy, but you're not like, is there some kind of like weird thing that's going to happen down the road, right? I think it's essentially a matter of where your heart is. And I think you can make sort of both work. I tend to believe that. So I'm in a bit of a weird position there because I am not an advocate of everything should be open source, as you've just seen, right? Yeah. I think that open source to be sustainable needs to make business sense, because if not, then like it doesn't work. Right? I mean, it sounds stupid, but like if I've seen a number of companies that were built around open source software, or where owners really wanted to open source things for this because open source is good, right? And then spending like decades or years at least of like struggling to make a living out of it, right? I don't think that's a good way of handling open source. Like I think as a business owner, you should focus on doing things that make sense for your business, right? And so I am not a strong proponent of the GPL because I generally tend to think that it's easier to create a community of people, a community of businesses around an Apache license than around the GPL license. Yeah. And I often see projects that are GPL based really struggle to just make a living.
Yeah, because it's a trap.
Because it's hard.
Yeah, you're removing decisions from other people. Like you're taking, you're ensuring a power imbalance between the copyright holder and the other people who you're supposedly offering the code to. You have rights that they don't have.
Oh, right. So there is that case. There is that too. So that's yet different. I mean, so that's another thing. I actually recommend that if you're really serious about open sourcing something, once you have a community built around it, you should give it away. And by giving away, I mean you should set up a small governance structure that is multi-vendor, multi-stakeholder, and you should give away license the copyright.
Have it held by
a foundation of some sort, right? Because that creates a much saner environment for everyone, right? And you really have people that are focused on benefiting the code, and you can continue being very influential in where the code goes by actually putting resources into it, but just being there and doing the work, right? So I don't advocate this at an early stage because it's just like costly and ineffective.
Right.
But I certainly recommend this if you have a project that has picked up steam, has a bunch of people depending on it from a business perspective. I think doing that is a much better thing. So when I'm thinking about large projects like that, I mean, for me, that's the biggest problem was sort of like the pseudo open source code that the pseudo open source that we were talking about, right?
Yeah.
Folk source, right? Is the problem is the governance, right? The problem isn't GPL versus Apache. That's the main problem to me. It's the governance model that is wrong, not so much the license choice. And you can have a completely sane environment with GPL license, like you can have a completely toxic environment with an Apache license. It sort of depends what the main copyright owner is doing and sort of what kind of requirements they have around the CLA.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
So yeah, but like to go back to the question, which is in terms of licenses, like I don't really see a benefit. So if you're looking at this from a business perspective, from your perspective, right? Mm-hmm. Do you fear being in a position where you have a competitor that is using your software and improving it, and you're not benefiting from these improvements?
No.
Because that's what a GPL would protect you from, right?
Yeah. So I think
this even so, actually, sorry, but given it's a SaaS, GPL would not protect you.
Right.
Because it requires redistribution, right?
Right.
So GPL would not protect you unless you're starting to do on-premise licensing.
Right.
In which case, then suddenly GPL comes into play again.
So I think this connects back to what you said earlier about some developers having a hard time monetizing open source projects. And I think there's two very different worldviews to come from. If I think about what software is a pretty young business in general, right? It's like 50 years, right? Maybe longer depending on how you look at it, but
well, yeah, maybe shorter.
Yeah, it's a pretty young business. There are lots of other businesses that have been around for a very long time all over the world. Service businesses, right? Construction,
sure.
Government, taxes, accounting, healthcare, right? Like these businesses have existed for a long time, and I keep thinking about what is it that we are trying to protect, that we're trying to hold to ourselves to keep as an advantage, and it's a design. Software is a design. It happens to be something that you can run, but it's a design. It's like the design of the tools or the algorithms or whatever that accountants use, that construction workers use. And it strikes me as like someone wanting to create a business out of a design for a tool versus someone who is running a business delivering services to happy customers and happens to use that same tool. It's a totally different direction to come from, and I am so convinced that my ability to do good work for customers and to provide service, right, which requires like answering their emails and making sure the software stays running and perceive how we could use the bag of tools to better meet their needs, like that understanding and communication and research. That's the business, and the software is a tool, and like keeping somebody else from using that tool, I really just don't think that stops me or helps me in running a business. It feels like a separate thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is why IBM just paid $34 billion for Red Hat, right?
Right.
I mean, they did not purchase the Fedora, right? You know, I mean, like the underlying code, right? They purchased everything that's around it. Absolutely, but you know, and yes, I mean, you know, the big problem comes from, I mean, when we get into these weird situations with open source and monetization, right? It's because we have an open source project and it's cool, and we're super excited to work on it, and we would like to work on it full time and make a business out of it.
Mm-hmm.
right? That is, I'm not going to say it never works because sometimes it does, right? But that is sort of like the wrong way around of like doing a business generally,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, usually you actually want to solve a problem of some sort,
Right.
and
Right.
then
And have some
you build like
customers.
things to solve that problem was, right? Yeah, right. So I mean, that's one of the reasons it's been really hard for a number of open source software just to become businesses because it's not the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, I definitely agree with you that there is basically there's a lot more to a business than just the code.
So much more.
100%, right? That said, depending on what your business is and who your clients are and how price sensitive they are, you can put yourself in a position where you get strangled if you're solely based on open source and you don't really have added value beyond that, or that value is not perceived as being valuable to your customers, which is the same thing, right? In which you get strangled by a competitor in your space that is just more, more funded than you are, and is ready to cut you down on prices, right?
Yeah. And I would
So
I would argue that that is going to happen whether or not my code is open source. That a competitor who wants to strangle me, who is more well funded, is very capable of just completely re-implementing the product, the set of features, and taking me out. For example, like Amazon just did with DocumentDB, right? There's no MongoDB code in there.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, that is something that can happen.
Yeah.
Right. And this is why businesses protect themselves with moat that are outside of the software space.
So that reminds me of the other thing I wanted to ask you is, what about this idea of releasing the code as open source, serving as a moat, where if I release the code, then there's more incentive for someone to pick that up and use it rather than like build something totally separate, and then they're more likely to share those improvements.
So open sourcing software is an excellent business strategy when you're basically commoditizing something that is the complement of the value you provide. Right? So, for example, Intel makes chips, right? They are the biggest contributor to Linux.
Wow.
It makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah, because it runs on their software.
Like suddenly if like Windows is the biggest thing, then they have to deal with Microsoft and whatever Microsoft wants to be able to, run that software on their chips, right?
Yeah.
And it also makes the whole product a lot more expensive. I mean, imagine like a customer has $100 to spend on a laptop, right? If it's Linux plus Intel gets like $100. If it's Linux plus, if it's Intel plus Windows, Intel gets 50. I mean, it's obviously not that simple, but right?
Yeah.
So commoditizing your complement is a really good strategy. And if you look at like every big player does that, right? So a Red Hat works on Linux because it's doing services around it. So it's commoditizing the stuff it does services around. You can't imagine building a $34 billion business on top of servicing and creating products around Microsoft Windows, right? Because that's already Microsoft's business,
Yeah.
right? Facebook, for example, which is essentially in the business of data mining at this point, right? Has actually open sourced a lot around data centers, data centers and servers and that kind of stuff, because it actually drives the cost of what it relies on to be a lot cheaper, right? Yeah, so it's a really good strategy for them, and the list goes on. So that's a really good strategy. If you're the thing if you open source your code, right, it's going to be much harder for someone to upset your position in the market than if they suddenly come with like a completely competing solution in a space that you weren't aware of.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, moving it to, I don't know, bots or like some, intercom bots or chat bots or whatnot, right? So yes, by open sourcing code, you are creating some form of moat around it, especially if your core value is not the code that you're open sourcing itself, but something that sits on top of it. And that is not easy to imitate or replace.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
And where the customer sees the value there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, no one that's using Facebook or buying ads on Facebook is going to be a customer of data center open source plans, right?
Totally. So this is
So, I mean,
super helpful. Like,
this has been super fun.
and I wanna mention like the real heart, the underlying motivation. So like, I've been asking for expert advice on this because I want to find out if there's any landmines that I'm about to step on, like if someone can stop me from hurting myself, right?
Sure.
But the real motivation is emotional, right? Like if I look at 20 years down the road, retired or talking with my grandkids, and one case is I had a business that made some money, but the code was closed, and eventually, it became irrelevant and the business shut down, but it made some money while it was open. And another case where the business didn't make as much money, maybe I lost some money on it.
That's
but
not
the code was open.
That's not even sure,
Right.
actually. I mean, I would imagine that maybe not short term, but long term, this can create a sort of community around it.
It seems that
that
way.
has additional benefits.
Yeah. So like I just want to. I would feel proud and happy, even if no community forms around it, if nobody is interested in it, at trying to give more to the rest of the world than I'm taking from it, if that makes sense, right? Like I don't think it's prohibiting me from earning a living, and it just
Right.
feels so
I mean,
much better to have done that.
I agree 100%. And I mean, you'll most often find people that are heavily invested in this space to have such backgrounds. I mean, I'm in there because I just think that bringing software into the common pool is a huge, has a massive beneficial effect to humanity, right?
Yeah, to
As a
people who
whole.
I couldn't otherwise do anything to help.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, 100%. That said, I think it's also important to do that in a sustainable way.
Yeah.
And a sustainable way means to actually think about what it means from a business perspective and to think about the business implications of what it is you're doing and see if, because, the other thing that could happen is you open source that thing, right? Some kind of company comes and steal the small customer base that you have because they're fast and aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're out of business. They stop. They're not going to contribute to the open source code because why would they if they have that attitude in the first place, right?
Right.
And so not only did you lose money, but you failed at your sort of like non-business mission.
Yeah. If there's a dead end on the code, I can no longer sustain
Yeah.
it.
Right. So that's I mean it sounds silly, but that's been sort of like the fight I've been trying to have for the last couple of years. It's about that if you actually want to make open source sustainable, it's not only about plastering the code and see what like sticks and what doesn't. It's also about being able to stick after the fact and like make it work and make it work long term. Make sure that you can build things around the code and continue making keeping it up to date to making sure that security issues are fixed and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
Right? Because if not, it's just a waste of everyone's time.
Yeah,
Right?
abandonware.
Including the poor soul that will bump into it in 3 or 5 years and like try to use it only to realize that it hasn't been maintained for like 2 years, and like half of the things are broken, don't work on the current systems, and that's a shame, right?
For sure.
So you want to, yeah. I mean, if I had to, for me, like open sourcing the core engine or like the core engine and some other things, if there are some other things in there, makes complete business sense and is really the right thing to do. Open sourcing the whole thing is more risky and is going to be harder to create a community of like-minded businesses around it.
Mm-hmm.
So I would not go that route.
Yeah.
If I had to summarize, I know it's a bit more work,
right? But maybe not that much.
but I can't assess that.
Well, thank you, Tobie. This is really, really great.
Well, I'm glad. Do let me know how it goes.
Yeah. So I guess we'll post this somewhere. Where should people go? So this product that we're talking about is chirpyhire.com. Where should people go if they want to find out more about the work that you do with advising, Tobie?
So I have my website at unlockopen.com. And they can also just shoot me an email at Tobie, Tobie, at unlockopen.com. And I also have a mailing list, which you should check out, in which you'll find a link from the main page of my website.
Cool. Thank you very much, Tobie.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, please do let me and let us know what decisions you make. Feel free to reach out if you have more questions in the future. And
Cool.
Good luck. It's it's an awesome project, and I'd love to see more small business owners take the route that you're taking. It's courageous, and we need more of that. Thank you.
Thank you.